Most people you talk to about the PlayStation Vita will sing its praises. It's often referred to as a system that was way ahead of its time, with its console-quality graphics and wide array of features. With so much love for it, you would probably assume the Vita was a big success. But of course, that was not the case, with the PS Vita being PlayStation's biggest failure ever. So what happened? How can a system that is almost universally beloved by everyone who played it sell so poorly? In today's video, we will look back at the story of the PS Vita to find out how not to save a console. All the way back in 2005, PlayStation had finally entered the portable game market with their PlayStation Portable. The PSP was a huge success, selling over 80 million units. But the PSP also had a lot of issues, primarily its rampant piracy. So while console sales were high, software sales were not keeping up. It got so bad that developers were hesitant to even make games for the platform. All of this is to say that Sony really needed to move on. And so with that, development of the PlayStation Vita began all the way back in 2007. Sony's primary goal with this new system was to deliver console quality games on the go, and as we moved closer to its official reveal, rumors started swirling. As early as 2009, websites were reporting on the existence of the device. Those rumors continued through the early 2010s, with most referring to it as the PSP2. Sony officially confirmed the console's existence for the first time on January 27, 2011 at a PlayStation press event held in Japan. At that time, Sony was publicly referring to the console as the NGP, or Next Generation Portable. Sony's CEO Kaz Hirai stated that the NGP was aiming for mass-wide appeal, featuring the traditional joysticks and button layout that gamers would be used to, while also featuring touchscreens that smartphone users could relate to. The level of console-quality graphics that the NGP would feature became a big debate. Some claimed it would have the power of the original Xbox, while Sony themselves at one point made the bold claim that they were aiming for PS3-level graphics. They later clarified that this would not actually be the case, and instead the console would land somewhere in between a PSP and a PS3. So while the NGP wouldn't be able to replicate the PS3, even being anywhere close to it would be a major accomplishment. That would be unlike anything we had ever seen in the portable gaming market before. At the Game Developers Conference in 2011, some other new announcements were made regarding Sony's NGP. It was revealed here that the console would be moving away from the PSP's famous UMD discs in favor of cartridges. It was also announced that the console would feature a front and back touchscreen alongside two cameras, further solidifying Sony's attempt to capitalize on the smartphone market. With the preliminary details of the console being laid out, it was now time for the NGP's official reveal at E3 2011. At PlayStation's E3 2011 press conference, they officially revealed the NGP for the first time. First and foremost, it was time to announce the official name, the PlayStation Vita. This name was pretty shocking, honestly. Sony is usually so standard with the name of all their consoles. The home console PlayStations all just go by their respective numbers, and then their first portable was fittingly titled PlayStation Portable. That's why so many people had been referring to Vita as PSP2 throughout development, because that just made sense. To see them go against this name structure was very interesting. You can even hear the crowd kind of pause for a second before clapping as they try to process what they've just heard. Kaz Hirai explains that Vita means life, symbolizing the console's goal of blurring the reality between entertainment and your real life. And indeed, Vita does mean life, stemming from the Latin word. As for his claim that the Vita would blur your reality, I'm not so sure about that one, but yeah, sure, PS Vita it is. Next, Kaz Hirai confirms many of the features that we knew were coming to Vita, including the two joysticks, OLED screen, front and rear touchpads, and the front and back cameras. He mentions the cameras as the feature he is most excited for, specifically in the context of augmented reality. This was a feature that was all over the Vita's marketing, but unfortunately, augmented reality really never took off. It was a very niche feature that really only got used for gimmicks and tech demos, rarely for actual games. So this focus on augmented reality didn't quite work out. Next, they talked about the 3G Wi-Fi model, and this is the part of our story where things started to take a turn for the worse. This 3G Wi-Fi initiative would require a data plan, and Sony would be partnering with AT&T as the exclusive carrier for this service in North America. As these words leave Kaz Hirai's mouth, you can hear members of the audience audibly laughing. After a mix of boos and polite cheers, Kaz simply says, "There we go," and quickly moves on. This partnership with AT&T became a major issue for Vita customers, but more on that later. The final big feature Kaz Hirai highlighted were some of the social features, including Party Chat and Near, a social application on the device. These features helped the Vita more closely resemble what you would expect to see on a home console, which was nice to see. With the major features out of the way, it was now time to talk about the most important part of any console, The games. First came a big one with Uncharted Golden Abyss from Bend Studio. Featuring a gameplay showcase that came directly from the system itself, Golden Abyss was pretty mind-blowing. It genuinely looked console quality, and seeing it all running off the Vita directly as opposed to a pre-recorded video was so impressive. It looked like it would be a very faithful Uncharted game, despite being on a portable console for the first time. The game would incorporate a lot of the Vita's new features, such as touch controls for climbing and stealth combat. However, these touch controls would not be forced on you, and if you wanted to just use traditional buttons, you could do that as well. This was the perfect best of both worlds scenario, and it fell in line with Sony's prior messaging that the Vita was aiming to be a platform for everyone. The Uncharted demo was a hit, and it was a great first game to showcase the Vita. Now it was time for the other games shown at this press conference to continue the momentum. After Uncharted came a game called Ruin. This game looked promising, but was ultimately cancelled and never released. After that, they showed off a new Mod Nation Racers. This was a franchise Sony was pushing pretty hard at the time, but it never really truly took off. We did get another major announcement with Little Big Planet coming to Vita. LBP was one of Sony's biggest franchises at the time, so this was huge. And the Vita seems like a perfect fit for the series, with the touchscreen allowing for even better control of the level editor. That was it for Sony's first party showcase. Now it was time for the big moment. It was time to announce the price of the Vita. PlayStation knows better than anybody how important this moment was going to be. Kaz Hirai returned to the stage and announced that the Wi-Fi only version of the Vita would retail for $250, with the 3G model being $300. This was big. Keep in mind, Nintendo's new handheld, the 3DS, had also launched at $250. Considering how much more powerful the Vita was than the 3DS, this was best case scenario for PlayStation. The Vita reveal wasn't perfect. The AT&T flub was an awkward moment, and some of the game announcements didn't pan out in the long run. But overall, this was a very positive showcase, and the Vita seemed to be in a really good position as we got closer to launch. The Vita launched in Japan on December 17, 2011, with a worldwide release following shortly after in February 2012. The launch lineup was strong, with 25 games being available day one. This included a really nice showing from Sony's first-party games. IPs like Hot Shots Golf, Wipeout, and Mod Nation Racers were there day one. On top of that, Sony had a new IP with Little Deviants, a tech demo-style game that was meant to show off everything the Vita had to offer. And then of course there was also the big one, with Uncharted Golden Abyss being there for launch. I think you would be hard-pressed to find a bigger, more impactful launch title throughout PlayStation's entire history. Not only because Uncharted was their biggest franchise at the time, but also because of what Golden Abyss represented as a showcase of the Vita's potential. The Vita got off to a very strong start, with the system quickly selling around 1.2 million units after launching in all regions. But that momentum faded fast, with the system struggling to sell even 50,000 units per month in the time that followed. The Vita's first full year on the market was fairly stacked with games, including first-party hits like Gravity Rush, Resistance Burning Skies, and Little Big Planet PS Vita. The third-party support was also strong, including some pretty massive exclusives such as Persona 4 Golden and Call of Duty Black Ops Declassified. Despite this nice lineup of games, interest just wasn't there for the console. After 10 months on the market, the Vita had only managed 4 million units sold. So why was this happening? The system itself was fantastic, delivering everything it had promised, if not even more. The game output early on was great, and seemingly everyone who had gotten their hands on this thing loved it, but still, no one was buying it. There were a few reasons for this, including things that were both in and out of Sony's control. First, let's talk about the things PlayStation did wrong. The 3G model was not the selling point they thought it would be. The AT&T controversy certainly didn't help, but keep in mind that was only an issue that affected North America. Even in other parts of the world, interest in the more expensive 3G model just wasn't there. Realistically, I think it's one of those features that sounds great until you actually try it. Like, oh man, I can play online games anywhere, even if I don't have a Wi-Fi connection. This is awesome. And then you try to play Mortal Kombat on 3G and quickly realize it's not so awesome. Ultimately, it was a feature that made sense to try with the rise of mobile gaming, but it didn't work out. Consumers weren't moved by this feature enough to want to spend more money on the console itself and then also pay for data. This left Sony with a lot of unsold 3G models. Speaking of paying for things, one of the other big controversies surrounding the Vita's launch were the memory cards. The PS Vita consoles had a minuscule amount of storage on the system, so a memory card was essentially required if you wanted to play or download literally anything. And these memory cards were absurdly expensive. A measly 4GB memory card would cost you $20, with the most expensive card being 32GB of memory for a whopping $100. Sony had their reasons for wanting proprietary memory cards, primarily due to the PSP's hacking issues. And while that's certainly understandable, there was no reason to make these cards so expensive. Of course, these memory cards were not the sole reason why the Vita failed. If the console was popular enough, people would have sucked it up and paid, but it was a major turnoff for many consumers, especially those who may have been on the fence about the system. Speaking of that, let's talk about the Vita's competitors. First, we had Nintendo's 3DS. The 3DS got off to a very slow start after its launch in early 2011, but had gained a lot of momentum right around the time the Vita was released. I mentioned how the 3DS launched at a similar price point to the Vita, $250. That was seen as a major win for Sony. However, by the time the Vita actually released, Nintendo had slashed the price all the way down to $170. Combine that with some major releases Nintendo had put out in the holiday of 2011, and the 3DS started to fly off the shelves. I often wonder about what would have happened if the Vita had launched earlier in the 3DS lifecycle, before that console's comeback. Because basically what ended up happening was Sony released the Vita right at the exact moment everyone decided they wanted a 3DS. The other major competitor to Vita was smartphones. And this is another example of the Vita releasing at a very bad time. The smartphone revolution was a really weird time in gaming's history when you look back at it now. Everyone was so convinced that mobile gaming was going to come in and change everything we knew about the gaming industry. Everyone said traditional gaming would cease to exist soon and everyone would just play games on their phones. As we look back now, over a decade later, we can see that that never really happened. Mobile games and console games very much remained separate entities, and while there is some crossover, most people nowadays have accepted that these are two different sectors of the gaming market that can exist together. But back in 2012, this wasn't how people thought, and unfortunately for the Vita, it launched right into the peak of this, right around the time that people were really getting into mobile gaming and saw it as the be-all end-all future. So a lot of gaming companies looked at a device like the Vita and thought, why make games for that thing when I can make games on smartphones? It's ironic because traditional portable gaming has made a roaring comeback in recent years with the Switch and Steam Deck dominating the market. It makes you feel like if the Vita were to release today, it would be a smash hit. But unfortunately, the Vita did not release today. It was released in 2012 into a much different gaming landscape. With the Vita struggling to find a significant audience, things started to fall apart quickly. Sony was left scrambling, desperately trying to find a way to save the console. The first step Sony took to try and garner interest in the Vita is a common one we've seen throughout this series, which is of course a price drop. In August 2013, the price of Vita consoles was cut down to $200. Around this same time, the 3G model began being phased out. On top of the system seeing a price drop, memory cards also saw a price cut. Price drops on these cards ranged from $5 to $10 less for the smaller cards, all the way up to $20 less for the largest card. This was a nice price cut, but it ultimately did little to change consumers' minds. It didn't really help move consoles, primarily because game output had now started to lack. Major third parties had begun to shun the console. You weren't seeing any of those major exclusives like we got in 2012 anymore. Even a lot of multi-platform games had already given up on making Vita versions at all. Meanwhile, on the first-party side, PlayStation was struggling to keep up. The only major first-party exclusives we got on Vita in 2013 were Tearaway, Soul Sacrifice, and Killzone Mercenary. Most of the other high-profile releases such as Sly Cooper Thieves in Time or Dragon's Crown were also available on PS3, diluting the necessity to own a Vita. This was a trend that Sony did throughout the Vita lifecycle. A lot of games on Vita were also released on either the PS3 or the upcoming PS4. I think in some ways Sony thought this was a good thing. They thought people would be impressed that their PS3 game could be played on the go. Sony even introduced the cross-buy initiative around this time. This was a very pro-consumer move that entitled you to a Vita version of the PS3 game you had bought. For example, if you bought a copy of PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale on PS3, you were entitled to the Vita version as well. This was amazing for customers who owned both consoles, and I think Sony expected this to garner interest in the Vita. Someone may look at their collection and think, hey, I'm already entitled to all these Vita games, I should just go pick one up. But that didn't really come to fruition, and in some ways may have actually had the opposite effect, with people feeling like the Vita didn't have enough true exclusive games. As we moved into the latter half of 2013, PlayStation was a bit preoccupied, gearing up for the release of their next home console, the PlayStation 4. As you can imagine, the launch of the PS4 took a lot of time, resources, and energy from Sony's end. This further cut into the already shrinking amount of first-party games available for the Vita. However, Sony didn't quite count the system out yet, as Vita was fairly present throughout PS4's early life cycle. Sony was continuing to push the cross-buy initiative with games like Resogun. Meanwhile, they were also starting a new initiative with Remote Play. Remote Play would essentially allow you to play PS4 games on your Vita. Obviously, these games would not be running on the Vita natively, as that would be nearly impossible. It was a stream that could go to your Vita. What was really cool about this was that it allowed you to play PS4 games anywhere, because as long as your PS4 was on and the Vita had a Wi-Fi connection, you could sync in. Sony pushed remote play pretty hard. This wasn't some niche feature you had to try and figure out existed. It was all over the PS4's early marketing. On the back of every early PS4 game box, the Vita was prominently displayed. Remote play added a decent amount of new value to the Vita, and I think it was really smart for Sony to try this. Unfortunately though, remote play technologically wasn't quite where it is today, and once again, Vita didn't see a big boost in sales. Similar to the cross-buy initiative, it was something that those who already owned a Vita thought was really cool, but it wasn't getting new customers in. Okay, so Sony tried adding value to the console through price cuts and new features, and that didn't help. So now it was time to try some revisions of the console. First came the PS Vita 2000, also known as the Slim. This version would be slightly thinner and lighter while making the move to a traditional LCD display instead of LED. This helped keep costs down and marginally increase battery life. The 2000 model didn't do much to move the needle for the Vita, though I doubt Sony really expected it to. This was just a standard mid-generation revision. The real interesting move they made was a new device titled the PlayStation TV. The PlayStation TV, also known as the PS Vita TV in some regions, is a fairly obscure device. It was primarily meant for the Chinese gaming market since traditional gaming consoles were banned in that region, but in many ways, it was also seen as Sony's last-ditch effort to extract some value from the Vita. The PlayStation TV allows you to play Vita games on your television, compatible with both DualShock 3 and DualShock 4 controllers. As you can imagine though, a lot of Vita games struggled with this due to the touchscreens. Most games were still compatible though, and the PS TV is a pretty useful device for very specific instances, such as trying to capture footage of Vita games. For the average consumer though, the PS TV really had no practical use, and playing Vita games on a TV takes away the whole selling point of the console quality games on the go. Unsurprisingly, the PS TV was quickly discontinued and faded into obscurity. After Sony's failed attempts to garner an audience for Vita, they quickly abandoned the handheld. 2014 was a suspiciously quiet year for the platform in terms of first-party releases, with Sony only managing collections and some PSN games that were usually also available on PS4. 2015 was an equally quiet year, and in October of that same year, Sony confirmed our fears and made a statement that no first-party teams were currently developing for Vita. Despite keeping up some PR talk about great third-party support and new age groups interacting with Vita, it was pretty clear at this point that the console was done. However, the next few years of Vita were surprisingly positive, all things considered. The handheld became a beacon for indie games. Indie developers noticed how passionate Vita players were, and that they were happy to support almost anything released for their beloved handheld. And with Sony having abandoned the console, indie developers weren't competing with major first-party releases. This allowed the Vita to stay somewhat relevant for a few extra years, and it was a nice story to see play out. I felt it was important to mention that in this video, because while the Vita was certainly a commercial disaster for Sony, it did garner a dedicated audience that loved it, and it allowed for a lot of indie developers to get their games out there and find success they may not have found elsewhere. I think that's really special, and it's part of why I feel so fondly about the Vita. Despite the feel-good story of the Vita late in its life, we can't pretend like the system was a success by any means. In 2019, the console was officially discontinued. Sony stopped reporting official numbers a few years into its life, but it's estimated to have only sold around 16 million units, making it the worst-selling PlayStation console of all time by a giant margin. After Vita's discontinuation, PlayStation left the portable games market entirely, and that brings us to the present day. Now is the point in the video where we look back on everything we've learned and figure out how not to save a console. First off, we'll once again acknowledge something that was completely out of Sony's control, and that is just the unlucky timing of the Vita. It was right in the prime of mobile gaming, before it was seen as non-threatening to traditional gaming. The Vita was also released at the point in time when portable traditional gaming was at its lowest point in popularity. And then, right around the time Sony gave up on the Vita, interest in console quality gaming on the go came back in a huge way with the Switch. So it really was a scenario where Sony released this thing during the worst possible era of gaming. Despite these hurdles that were out of their control, Sony did still make a lot of major mistakes that hurt the Vita big time. The first was some questionable business decisions that turned off initial customers. The 3G model was a disaster, adding a lot of unnecessary controversy for a feature that most did not even take advantage of. Meanwhile, the proprietary memory cards were understandable due to the experience of the PSP, but there was no reason to make them so expensive. Having required memory cards cost that much, and having a 3G subscription service model made the Vita seem a lot more expensive than it should have been. The next big issue issue I think the Vita had was that it didn't always know what it wanted to be. And here's what I mean by that. The Vita was constantly marketed as a console quality device on the go, but at the same time, Sony wanted to chip into the mobile gaming space by adding touchscreens and mobile phone features like cameras. I think this put the Vita in a weird spot, desperately trying to cater to all audiences instead of focusing its efforts on just one. The Vita would have been much better off leaning entirely into the console games on the go selling point, but that just wasn't the mentality of the gaming industry at the time. Everyone was far too petrified of mobile games and felt that if they didn't cater to them, they would fail. I am sure that if the Vita released today, Sony would do things quite a bit differently in this department, and probably have a good amount of success in doing so. Finally, the main reason why the Vita failed is simply because Sony did not sufficiently support it with high-quality exclusive games. In one of my prior How to Save a Console videos, I talked about the PlayStation 3. Sony saved that console through three main strategies: a price cut, a console revision, and a killer lineup of exclusive games. Now let's look at the Vita. We got the price cut, we got the revision, but we never saw Sony go all in with games. And this is a major issue PlayStation seems to have with a lot of their non-home console products. Whenever something doesn't quite work out immediately, they are very quick to drop it and just focus back on their home consoles. Look at the Vita or PlayStation VR 1 and 2 as examples of this. As a huge PlayStation fan, it is easily my least favorite thing about the brand. It makes even someone like myself hesitant to support them on certain products. To focus back on PlayStation's handheld consoles specifically, the games we got always felt inferior to those on the home consoles. The big franchise games released on PSP or Vita were always spin-off games, and usually weren't developed by the original developers of said franchise. There isn't necessarily anything wrong with this, as we got plenty of great games through this over the years, but I just feel like when you do that, you are indirectly devaluing your platform. Compare it to Nintendo at that time, who had no issue releasing the brand new Zelda game or the next numbered Mario Kart game on their handheld. In some cases, Nintendo's biggest franchises lived primarily on handheld, such as Pokemon, but PlayStation handhelds got collections and games not from their original developers. Again, I'm not saying that means these games are automatically bad, but it does make them feel less like a must-own for the average fan. Vita never got to see Sony's big guns like Naughty Dog or Santa Monica make a game for the platform. Those studios, among others, were the ones that helped PS3 get out of the hole. Who's to say they couldn't have done the same for Vita? Ultimately, it came down to a management issue, as Sony just never quite figured out how to support two consoles at once in the same way Nintendo did for so many years. It made all the sense in the world for Sony to shift focus to PS4 instead of Vita, because that console was so much more successful. But I can't help but wonder what could have been if Sony had been able to find a way to meaningfully support both. I hope you enjoyed this episode of How Not to Save a Console. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, it really helps me out a ton. And let me know in the comments down below which saved or not saved consoles you would like to see me talk about next.